Hi, good evening. I'm Duncan McRae, an associate professor of ancient Greek and Roman studies and a faculty affiliate of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, the BCSR. On behalf of the BCSR and my colleagues, Professor Susanna Elm, Professor Emily Mackel, and myself, I'm delighted to welcome you all here in person and online to this opening and signature lecture in the 2021-2022 Voting the Divine lecture series. We're delighted to have with us as our guest and speaker this evening, Professor Clifford Ando. Professor Ando deserves a full introduction, and he will be introduced properly in a few moments by Susanna. Since this is the first lecture in our series of 6 over the next year, it seems fitting for us to introduce the series and the wider project, Voting the Divine, Collective Decision-Making and Religious Authority Between Polytheism and Monotheism. Voting the Divine is part of the Berkeley Democracy and Public Theology program, which is hosted by the BCSR and has been supported by a major grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. This lecture series has also been supported by the Townsend Center for the Humanities. Voting the Divine is intended as a collective investigation of the place of democratic practice and theory in religious life in pre-modern Western and Southern Eurasia, from Rome to Bengal, from the classical Greek polis to the Mughal Empire. Until very recently, the history of democracy has had a rather familiar shape and secular tone. It goes something like this, of course. An exceptional ancient Greek experiment in Athens, certainly, and in some other city-states, faltered soon faltered. Only a surprising revival of democratic ideals and politics in the 17th and 18th century North Atlantic culminated in a 1989 moment of apparent global democratic triumph. But the often tumultuous historical events of the past 3 decades, the end of history, if you will, and the urgent rethinking of democracy that has accompanied them makes new and different histories of democracy possible, we contend. Rather than assume the centrality of democratic polities, that is, democracies, democratic states, and the secularity of the democratic, we take our cue from contemporary political thought and historical experience to look instead for democratic practices in relation to religion. We are interested in voting, yes, but also in deliberation and debate, in public claim making and popular demands. In pre-modern societies, these were not disenchanted practices, as they might be today. Collective human decisions were influenced by and competed with the sources of divine authority, including communal traditions, priestly expertise, oracles, and scriptural hermeneutics. We must think, too, then, about theorizations of popular will in these communities. Was vox populi vox Dei? Was the voice of the people really or ever the voice of God, as a medieval European proverb went? Our hope for Voting the Divine is to reconsider not just that traditional history of democracy, but also the histories of pre-modern religious life, to take a deeper and comparative historical view of the varied configurations of democracy and religion. Within the project of Voting the Divine, this lecture series is complemented by a graduate seminar this semester, which I'm teaching with Susanna, on democracy and religion in the Roman Empire, and a graduate working group, which has brought together 8 excellent young scholars to think about the politics and religion of pre-modern Eurasia. We have also launched a BCSR community outreach program, which is aimed at connecting humanistic and social scientific study of religion here on campus with our wider community in the East Bay. We thank the Henry Luce Foundation and the principal investigators for the Berkeley Democracy and Public Theology program, David Marno and Jonathan Sheehan, and formerly Karen Barkey too, for their support for this project and for tonight's lecture. And with that, I pass you to Professor Susanna Elm to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I'm absolutely delighted, and it is truly, truly my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker and the first in our series, Clifford Ando, the David B. and Clara E. Stern Distinguished Service Professor and Professor in the Departments of Classic and History and in the College at the University of Chicago. It is an immense honor to have him here and also a real joy because Cliff is really the first real-life lecturer, the first person whom we can really joyfully welcome back here to Berkeley after quite some hiatus for reasons that we do not need to dwell upon. Cliff Ando is in fact one of those people where you can say, and it's not a cliche, he does not need an introduction. Nevertheless, because we have a far broader audience and we would like to reach, the greatest audience we can via Zoom, I will nevertheless introduce him. Professor Ando's research has for many years now focused on the intersection of law and religion, and that is an entirely separate and quite complex problem, on religio, which is not at all the same thing as religion. He has thought deeply and long on the intersection and the relevance of law for the matter of the gods in the ancient world, in particular in the Roman Empire. Beginning with his first book, Imperial Ideology and the Provincial Loyalty in the Roman Empire, which was published by UC Press in 2000, and has won the prestigious Goodwin Award of Merit of the Society of Classical Studies, which was once upon a time known as the American Philological Association. Ever since that first book, Cliff Ando's work has been groundbreaking. Already in that book, he brought into intense dialogue questions of imperial power and local change, the role of religion in ascertaining or not the cohesiveness of the Roman Empire, as well as the role of Latin as a language of law and religio. Since then, these concerns have been central for Professor Ando's work. He has published path-breaking books not only on the matter of the gods, religion and the Roman Empire, published in 2008, also by UC Press, in which he juxtaposed Cicero on the nature of the gods with Augustine to make the case for the centrality of knowledge in Roman religion. In a sense, he pointed out that Roman religion is empiricist. If it works, it's good, keep going. If not, try something else and new, which goes a long way to explain why Roman religion was so open for new influences. He has also worked on questions of citizenship, toleration, legal pluralism, and decision-making processes in pre-modern empires more generally. And in his work, he always combines trenchant theoretical questions on cognition, analogy, deduction, and abstraction in the matters of legal thinking, for example, in books such as Roman Social Imaginaries, Language and Thought in Context of Empire, or in Law, Language, and Empire in the Roman Tradition. He combines these trenchant insights with deep study and deep engagement with the original sources. Another hallmark of Cliff Ando's exceptional scholarship is his full embrace of collaboration. His co-edited volumes are numerous, and I will not enlist them, but I would like to point you to his most recent collaboration with William P. Sullivan, The Discovery of the Fact. What is a fact in legal thinking? You could hardly think of a more timely work. It was published in 2020. Or else he's about just published together with Miles Lavin, Roman and Local Citizenship. In the long 2nd century, again, citizenship, of course, a perennial important question, and particularly here, because it was just prior to the universal citizenship granted to most people within the Roman Empire. He is also the general editor of Roman Statutes, Renewing Roman Law, a collaborative project that unites him with our dear colleague Carlos Noreña, and that will produce a new edition for all epigraphically preserved Roman laws. That's a big deal. He is the general editor of Bryn Mawr Classical Review. He serves on many editorial boards. His international recognition is breathtaking, from Paris to Oxford to South Africa to Germany, British Columbia, New Zealand. You can see the reach is far and wide. We are absolutely delighted that Cliff Ando is going to open our Voting the Divine series today with Republican Religion in Republican Rome. And originally it had a question mark. Please, Cliff.
Thank you very much for the exceptionally kind introduction. I think the question mark was actually the result just of my, I feared that the title was entirely too vague, and I think I was asking, will this do? Is it okay? And then I found it was reproduced in some document I was sent. It was reproduced in the form I signed. Could this be videotaped? And I was like, okay. Yeah, I think that's how I was taught in typing class. And once upon a time. Anyway, I hope the title doesn't oversell. So I, as you see, I've taken my mask off. I might have been able to surmount some challenges by having this printed in a larger font, but I do have the difficulty that, and I don't think this would have been so much of a challenge if I was, if I had done this 10 years ago, but I now really can't see anything without an extra set of glasses. And if I wear the glasses or the mask, then they steam up and I'd read sort of like every other line. So I'm just throw off the mask. So there's really an extraordinary number of kind of very fascinating topics would be embraced. I'm going to talk about Roman evidence as it bears on something like voting of the divine. Maybe that the title Republican Religion and Republican Rome sort of oversells, or it's not quite specific, but I'll just get going and see how it goes. I mean, within Roman history, there are all sorts of things that might have occurred to a kind of standard Roman historian to talk about. The conjoining of the terms democracy and religion might send you scurrying in the direction of something like what we might call the influence of religion on the functioning of the Roman democracy. Oh, wait, I was about to wander off to I think I have to stand here to be in view of the camera. My inclination, now I can't see. My inclination certainly when lecturing is to sort of wander hither and thither, but I think I'm tethered to the positioning of the camera in this case. And certainly virtually anyone who's studied Roman history will be familiar with the kind of famous confrontation between Julius Caesar and his colleague in the consulate, Marcus Bibulus, in 59 BC, in which Marcus Bibulus tried to arrange to, in essence, put the brakes on legislative activity to court by announcing that he was watching for adverse omens. And the point being, needless to say, that if a magistrate saw an adverse omen, no public activity was supposed to take place, and the assembly could not meet. Now, usually the magistrate made such an announcement in person in front of the people, which adjourned the possibility of action for the day. Confronted by what were probably real threats of physical harm from Caesar's partisans, Bibulus retreated to his house and made his announcements by messenger. This is actually now, I mean, in the era of COVID, I take it that you could actually, it would be entirely acceptable for, Dylan to send in a note saying, a swallow passed my house in the wrong direction. The faculty meeting is called off for the day. But then it struck everyone as very odd that Bibulus would send a slave to tell everyone, the assembly should shut down. Confronted by this, as I say, Bibulus just sat at home and sent in sort of somebody with a 3x5 card. And Caesar, of course, as is perfectly well known, proceeded not only to legislate, but because Bibulus didn't leave his house, Caesar retained throughout the year the fasces and the right to speak first before the public assembly and so on, which should have alternated month by month between the consuls. And it's hard to know whose conduct, either Caesar's or Bibulus, made a greater mockery of religious norms and of other norms for that matter. Now, a second and actually very interesting area of religious influence on politics came about through the Roman use of sortition, in essence, use of the lot to distribute all manner of public powers, which they did, so far as one can tell, as a kind of traditional matter for a very long time until one day when they didn't, or at least in select matters, stopped using the lot. And it's quite clear, I think, from Roman theory that they thought of the lot as essentially inviting possibly the influence of the dying, although the gods might not be paying attention that day and the roll of the dice might just been a roll of the dice, but they were in fact inviting divine influence on the distribution of public powers. And then one day they did not. And there are, any numbers of patterns like this. One of my favorite puzzles in Roman history of this kind is, for a very long time, as the Romans extended the distribution or the dispersal of Roman citizens in space, they added new tribes, the equivalent of adding a new parliamentary district or a new district to Illinois as you spread people out, until at a moment just inside a break in our access to Livy's history, that is immediately prior to the start of Livy's Hannibalic books, they conquered land north of the Po and simply stopped creating new voting tribes, and simply assigned those people to a pre-existing tribe. And what looked like an earlier logic in which voting tribes were comprised of social units of population that might have formed solidarity around their geographic contiguity, that if that's what mattered to them then, which we do not know, but if that mattered to them, it certainly broke in that moment. And at a later moment, they began assigning people inside voting tribes to other voting tribes, so that the kind of unity of the voting tribe, even in its secondary logic, was broken. And we have no access in those two cases to the debate that might have taken place. But I'm digressing from religion. But they're sort of on theme, because one of the things I'm going to talk about today is a pattern of the cessation of action, and how we might try to write histories about patterns of cessation in action. I haven't got an answer, so don't get excited. I'm just gonna put the problem before you. But of course, I think what Duncan, Emily, and Susanna had in mind was something rather different, namely the use of democratic forms of judgment and decision-making in religious affairs. Oh, wait, sorry. Yeah, right. Here, an obvious area of inquiry. I'm going to skip these because these are the things I'm not talking about, so I'm not going to read out the material on the slide, but it's there to distract you. An obvious area of inquiry might be the back and forth in Rome over the means by which persons were selected to hold public priesthoods. Priests of various kind were chosen, priests of various kind were not chosen by the people before they were. That is, public priesthoods were not subject to election until they were made available by election. But then later elections were disallowed before being allowed again. Nor does this summary do justice to the wrangling and legalitarian ambiguation that in fact went on, and I won't bother translating here, but there's Cicero and others claim that there was some very complicated rule by which it seemed inappropriate in the case of the Pontifex Maximus to allow the pontificate or the high pontificate to be distributed by voting, but they felt it important to distribute by voting nevertheless. So they allowed an odd number of the tribes, 17 out of 35, to vote on the pontificate, and then by a sort of legal fiction allowed the majority of those 17 tribes to stand in for what would have been a majority of the people. And they believed very sincerely, so it goes, that they were thereby not subjecting the pontificate to an election by the majority of the people, because quite literally the majority of the people was not voting. That's exactly the sort of legalitarian bullshit the Romans did all the time. Instead, I want to talk around and around another matter, namely how it was decided that which gods were to be worshipped, and up to a point when they were to be worshipped, and even more, how they were to be worshipped, setting aside the very interesting question of why the Romans chose to worship any given god, not because the question is uninteresting, but because inquiry into the matter is so often hijacked by Augustine's reading of Varro that you sort of shy away from the topic. We can take it up later if you wish. But within this rather large topic, what I want to end up talking about is the question of how it was that republics decided to stop worshiping particular gods. And that, so far as I can tell, is not a subject that has received a great deal of attention. On the contrary, popular attention certainly, and I think a great deal of scholarly attention, focuses on the question of the Romans taking up of new gods, proceeding on the assumption that polytheist systems are essentially and always additive, which is, of course, as a comparative religious matter, completely wrong. We chart the expansion of the Roman pantheon as some kind of index, as an index of something, in the same way that scholars of Roman history are continuously trying to identify, sort, list, and count the senators who were recruited from the provinces, or which provinces have the most citizens, and so on. This, we are assured, is telling us a story about Rome. And it's generally, we are assured also that this is a comforting story about Rome, that they ceased to be interested in domination and became interested in something else. Nor is this, in fact, wholly misguided. Among other things, it was possible for the Romans to conceive the history of public cult as one of gradual expansion in the number of gods who were worshipped via public rites. The structure of Varro's divine antiquities was determined by a number of priorities, but Book 1 dwelt for a time on the increase in public cult under the kings, and a structuring role in Varro's narrative appears to have been played by itemization of gods that were added, as he puts it, by king. Titus Tatius added Saturnus, Ops, Sol, Luna, Volcanus, Lex, Cloacina. Numa added many gods and many goddesses. What is more, there were authors, Christian authors as it happens, who understood this process to have had as its telos the worship of, quote unquote, all gods, much as late ancient authors rewrote the history of Roman citizenship so that it had always already had as its telos the universalization accomplished by Caracalla. So here, from Minucius Felix, hence we see that throughout all empires, provinces, and towns, nations have their own rites and city dwellers worship their own gods, such that the Eleusinians worship Ceres, the Phrygians, Mother, the Epidaurians, Aesculapius, the Chaldeans, Belus, the Syrians, Astartes, the Taurians, Diana, the Gauls, Mercury, the Romans, all gods. Now, it goes without saying that the portrait given to us by the Christian authors of the High and Late Empire are partisan, probably in equal proportion as their data are problematic. But it remains true that the evidence for the cessation of public worship of any given god, or the ceasing to celebrate a particular rite, is very nearly a null set, which is not to say that there is none. And that presents me with a variety of challenges, both of form and method. The problem of form is naturally how to spin a tale when there are so few breadcrumbs, and the breadcrumbs themselves sort of trail off. I confess, as I say, I have no particular insight into the matter. There was a time when I told people that all the difficulties of my first book, which is kind of incredibly long and the organization is opaque, that it issued from a similar challenge, which is to see that it's easy to narrate the growth of an empire because it's a kind of chronological and geographic story. And it's wholly traditional to write the story of the fall of empires, on which there is this distinguished literature. But it wasn't clear to me, it certainly remains somewhat unclear to me, what's the appropriate form and what are the precedents for narrating something like the coming to be of stability. I had no solution for that then, and I have no solution for it now. The challenges of method are myriad, but I focus on two. Now, I'll mention some more as we go along, but I'll mention two now, and they concern the date and context that deliver us what we might think of as, quote unquote, the evidence for the issue before us. I'm going to offer an example of a similar issue in a related field, which will, I think, turn out to be something like the same field. This is a map published by Jörg Rübke of the distribution of find spots for the extant Fasti-style calendars of late Republican and imperial Italy from between the 1st century BCE and the 5th century CE. The very great bulk of them derived from the Julio-Claudian period, but the map has the virtue of being comprehensive. The style, which is to say their use of the so-called Fasti style, is what part of what makes them Roman calendars. The other thing that makes them Roman is their content. The calendars on this map list holidays and rituals that are topographically tied to the city of Rome. Indeed, for the most part, these calendars simply refuse to acknowledge anything about the existence of political or religious institutions or practices in the context other than Rome. By other than Rome, I mean the one in which they were actually found. What their utility was and what their symbolic function was in their context of discovery is kind of hard to say. A similar problem bedevils the study of Roman legislation. Is it clear that's a map of the Mediterranean? That's a map of the Mediterranean. The problem with this map is it was made with what I call technology, which is to say, I printed a map off the web of the Mediterranean. I wrote in little, those are X's made in pencil because I'm not as sophisticated as your group. I apologize then for the map. Anyhow, that's the Mediterranean and that's Spain, and we go all the way to, Ephesus and Mytilene there. So anyhow, those, and this is not all the Roman laws, but this is the ones where, I was looking through the index of Roman statutes. This is the ones where I thought I could zero in the spot without like looking up latitude and longitude. Anyhow, I think you get the point. If we were to map the fine spots of extant epigraphically preserved Roman laws, we're confronted from evidence from Rome and Campania, to be sure, but also from the Po Valley in southern Spain and the western coast of Turkey, and then Greece and Romania and Austria and so on. The field of Roman law probably has not asked precisely enough what questions this scattered material can be made to address, nor what aspects of the history of the Roman law of Rome are illuminated by laws that Rome wrote for others. In that sense, Rome is very much like the British Empire, which was very fond of writing constitutions for ex-colonies at the moment of decolonization. So Rome wrote lots of public law charters for other people and left nothing of the kind about itself. I suppose I'll set aside the very interesting problem that, as with the calendars, some of these bits of Roman legislation that we find here, particularly perhaps the Roman laws found in the Boot of Italy, contain clauses that are clearly tied exactly to the city of Rome. There are clauses down there about what to do when blah, blah, blah happens within the 5th milestone. Well, the stupid inscription was found farther than the 5th milestone, and what exactly they thought its normative power was to them is entirely unclear. Now, I'll say a bit more as I go along about the aggregation of evidence for what I'm terming Republican religion. But before I do that, I want to stress, or maybe just assert, some interlocking claims about Roman state religion that, however well known, constitute something like the hermeneutic conditions for the conclusions I'm ultimately going to try to reach about the subtraction of gods in Republican civic life. First, no god spoke to a human in the context of public cult at Rome. Or perhaps I should say, only one god ever spoke to a human on one occasion only, and the Romans did not know who that god was. Therefore gave that god a special name unique to that person, speaker sayer, Ios Lucutius, or some such. Second, outside of something like Hellenizing hexametric poetry, Romans of the classical period display something like no interest in etiological myth, in the sense that the Romans told stories about the origins of cities in such a way as to depict an originary and normatively proper version of a rite. These two features of public cult at Rome are obviously connected and have essential implications for the issue of correct performance. As no one had told the Romans how to perform an act of worship, the possibility always remained open that one could modify a rite, not in order to return to some original or earlier moment of purity. Instead, the Romans often modified in wholly new directions because the earlier form didn't seem to be working, or because you found, frankly, the earlier one hard to accomplish. There's a hilarious amount of Roman evidence on Roman religion about the substitution of one kind of object for another. Even if you were Greek, you would claim there was some original moment in the rite, and I don't know, like Jupiter was visiting your hut and said, I particularly like goat, and you would have some obligation to provide him with goat. But the answer is then in Rome, there's just endless substitution of one object for another. I mean, I didn't have time to get to, what is it? The Berkeley Bowl. So I went to the Safeway And they didn't have clementines. They only had like peaches. So today you're getting a peach. And then there would be a kind of theory about why the substitution would be entirely acceptable to the god. And the theory of the substitution would be that there would be a declaration using a third person imperative by the human that the rite has in fact been properly performed. And the entire system depends upon the gods agreeing with you as a purely conventional matter, that they are satisfied with what you've done. But to return to changes, right? So the Romans refer with some regularity to things that they call, among other things, permutationes and emendationes sacrificiorum, changes that they made in the form of a rite. And that, I think, is, I suppose, to summarize it, that's because the rites might be for the gods, but they were created by humans and thus amounted to human institutions. What transformed it into a political and communicative system, which we might call a religion, was the willingness of the gods to participate. The things invented and instituted by humans for the purposes of communicating with the gods included, on one theory at least, their names. This is a passage from Varro's Divine Antiquities as he's represented by Cicero in Book 4 of the City of God. The he here is, of course, Varro. For Varro confessed, you might say, Varro confessed that he did not pursue in accord with his own judgment the things that the Romans community had established. If he had been founding a new community, he would instead have consecrated the gods and their names according to the rule of nature. But as it was, as he was among an ancient people, he was obliged to hold to the history of nomina and cognomina as it was handed down from the ancients, and to record and examine them with this end in mind. The names by which the Romans address God, note he doesn't mention rites at all. He begins with names. The names by which the Romans addressed the gods in prayer and in vows were, on this argument, merely conventional, nor did the Romans have any verification beyond the efficacy of the ritual that the gods accepted to be addressed by the names that the Romans used. After all, the gods literally never spoke. Taking Varro seriously on this matter helps to explain the various ritual formulas in which the Romans addressed God by multiple names. So you find Roman rituals in which they say things like, to Eric or Leslie, whether male or female. Some instances of the use of such formulae may not be, as is conventionally understood, as purely syncretistic gesture, as there are people who interpret this as saying the Romans, that somehow Eric was the name of a Roman god and Leslie was the name of, well, let's say a Roman god and Leslie was the name of a Hellenist god. And you understood them to be sort of the same, and your use of the two names is a kind of generous gesture to all the various communities that did this. I think instead, on a number of occasions, the use of such formulae is a confession of ignorance and a plea for sympathetic understanding from one's counterparty, which is to say the god, in the communicative action. You didn't know what their name was, and you were hoping they were okay with being addressed as Eric or Leslie. I mention all this to establish a point, however, obliquely and tentatively about the ontological and epistemic status that Romans accorded to the networked and aggregated practices that constituted Roman religion, or given, I suppose, where this talk is going, I should say, what constituted Roman religion at any given moment. So I want now to turn to evidence for what I'm terming republican religion. As with public law, to wit, the evidence for the so-called Roman Constitution, so in respect of religion, a great deal of our evidence derives from elsewhere than Rome. What is more, a surprising amount of stuff that I'm going to cite derives from the period of republican monarchy, which is a point to which I'll return. It consists largely of evidence of three kinds: charters, calendars, and what we call leges sacrae, regulations for cults. Now, I've offered some information and perhaps a caution about this evidence by showing you these maps. I also want to make an argument for its relevance to today's conversation. I'm going to offer one argument now, and we'll make other arguments as we proceed. I present to you here three texts from three altars in three different regions, Gaul, Dalmatia, and Umbria, that cite, as it were, the laws of the altar of Diana on the Aventine. The first from an altar at Narbo from which we'll see another scrap of text later on. Let the other regulations for this altar and its text be the same as those that are for the altar of Diana on the Aventine. Then, from Dalmatia, let the other regulations for this altar be the same as those which are said to be for the altar of Diana on the Aventine. And then from Umbria, this temple of Augustin Salus has the regulations that are for Diana on the Aventine in Rome. I think it's pretty clear that each colonial party cites the and these are all from Roman colonies, by the way. It's pretty clear that each colonial party cites the regulations of the Temple of Diana on the Aventine, because the Temple of Diana on the Aventine was sort of Liz Hurley style, famous mostly for having leges. It's by no means clear that any of these people knew what those rules are. Indeed, it may be that the folks in Salona so lack confidence that they admit they'd only heard that the Temple on Diana had laws. I cite these documents, nevertheless, as only the most explicit evidence within a vast corpus that communities throughout the West, but colonies above all, sought to reduplicate locally or claim symbolically to be seeking to reproduce locally important aspects of practice at Rome. There's a similar moment in a late Republican jurisdictional law in which, in a text of just enormous detail, of which we have essentially one big piece of bronze, there's a moment where it says, and everything else you should just consult the album, the whitened board that the praetor at Rome sticks up. And this is a set of rules written for the regulation of colonies and essentially legal life north of the Apennines. And exactly how it was to help them, to tell them that, don't worry, there's a book of Roman law and it's in Rome. It is very unclear that there's a certain kind of structuring feature of the empire in which it turns out that at certain moments in Roman life, not simply the Romans, but others insist that knowledge was located at Rome. So there's a legal dispute over land between two people who are otherwise, I think, epigraphically entirely unattested, the Patokenses and the somethings in Sardinia. And at one point, one side very cleverly asks for, it's clear that they've lost repeated iterations of this legal dispute and keep finding ways, as you would in a legal system. It's one of the things that makes provincial legal systems very Roman. They insist that that they have a further grounds for appeal, and the procurator is pissed by the further delay, and they say, no, there's a forma, there's a map on bronze drawn up at the moment of the annexation of the province, which shows the correct boundary between the Patokenses and whoever Gaetulenses, I don't know. It's this inscription of Helvius Agrippa, and he has to give them a 3-month delay in the proceedings because they say the forma is in the tabularium at Rome. I don't know what the procurator thought was going on, but there was this possibility that knowledge, in fact, in this case, knowledge of self, knowledge of the relationship between two extremely localized tribes was actually housed at Rome. But I digress. In any event, there's a story to be written about knowledge in the Roman Empire. Now, you might object that these inscriptions are all Augustan or post-Augustan. And indeed, that is true. And the claim that is to say that they date from something like the area of Republican monarchy and not from the area of the Democratic Republic, and at least at Rome. And the claim I can make in reply that will bear on what follows is simply stated, but it may not satisfy you. So I happily admit that the bulk of the evidence for religion in communities of Roman citizens dates from the age of Republican monarchy. That's true not only of the evidence for practice, it is overwhelmingly so, but it's even true of normative texts. The municipal laws, for example, which are attested in fragments from several locales in Spain in the 1st century CE and from multiple Danubian communities in the 2nd century CE. Nor are these documents, some of which I will cite as evidence for something like quote unquote Republican religion. These documents are not without evidence of influence from the derivation from an age of monarchy. Communities, for example, are enjoined to worship the divinized emperors and the genius of the living emperor. Beyond this, the documents mention only Jupiter and the Dei Penates. There's the other gods worshipped in public cult at Rome are not mentioned in these municipal charters. And the extant Flavian municipal charter for Spain is about 14,500 words. We're missing a bunch of it, but it's big. But this is essentially this one rule about the swearing of an oath is about the totality of, as it were, quote unquote, Roman divinities mentioned in this text. Let him, the annual magistrate, swear in an assembly by Jupiter and the divine Augustus and the divine Claudius and the divine Vespasian and the divine Titus Augustus and the genius of the imperator Caesar Domitian Augustus and the Dei Penates, that he will accomplish properly whatever he deems in accordance with this law in the common interest of the municipal citizens of the municipality Flavia Ernitana. Now, the bulk of the chapters on public law are missing from all copies of all versions of what was clearly a fairly standard municipal law. But it is clear from the assorted oblique references to priesthoods in these documents that these communities reproduced the names, at least, of Roman offices. And it's also clear from this list of gods that much about whom the various municipia would worship was actually left to local initiative. I mean, we know epigraphically that these communities worship far more people than the Dei Penates and Jupiter, but this was not enjoined on them by Rome. As regards the issue of their derivation from an era when Rome was ruled by a monarch, I'd only point out, probably already been pointed out to people in Duncan and Susanna's seminar, that these local communities, hundreds upon hundreds of them, were emphatically republics. Their magistrates and councillors were elected, and it was magistrates who performed religious actions on behalf of the community, and the magistrates, together with the council, that determined whom the community as a community would worship. Which brings me to the question of what the magistrates and councillors were getting up to. The people in the seminar surely have read this. I quote here the 64th chapter of the Charter of the Caesarean Colony at Urso. Now, in this case, even the inscription is once again, quote unquote, imperial in date. It's the text was reinscribed in the Flavian period, but there are many reasons to believe that the copy was faithfully made. Among other things, the orthography of certain words is clearly Republican rather than contemporary, even though they used Flavian era letter forms. Probably can scarcely have done otherwise. So, whoever shall be the duowary after the foundation of the colony, they within 10 days next after that on which they shall have begun to hold that magistracy, are to raise with the decurions when not less than 2/3 shall be present, which and how many days it shall be agreed shall be festivals, in which sacrifices shall be publicly performed, and who shall perform the sacrifices. And whatever of those matters a majority of the decurions who shall then be present shall have decreed or decided, that is to be legal and binding, and those are to be the sacrifices and the festival days in that colony. In other words, it was elected magistrates who deliberated with the council over festivals and sacrifices, and the decision was made by majority vote. And I scarcely need to emphasize that the decision what festivals and sacrifices to conduct was perforce a decision about the gods to whom those honors would be directed. It's interesting enough that they write out the issue in this way. And as I think will become clear if you read more of the text, it has to do, the reason for this is because the celebration of festivals and the making of sacrifices, or the performance of sacrifices, involved money. So at some level, because this is a piece of public law, they were vastly more concerned with what were the people going to spend money on than the question of which god you were going to worship. But this is that question. The question who you worship is simply the question what sacrifice you perform. In other words, at the moment when the charter was written, it was unknown which gods the colonists would choose to worship. It was a colony of Roman citizens, of course, and so it was expected and enjoined they would worship the Catiline Triad. So from elsewhere in the same colonial charter, whoever shall be duowary, except for those who shall first be appointed after this statute, they during their magistracy are to organize a show or dramatic spectacle for Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, and the gods and goddesses during 4 days, for the greater part of the day, as far as shall be possible, according to the decision of the decurions. This is a completely hilarious text. It goes on to discuss various things you should do if something goes wrong in the celebration of the ritual. It says repeatedly, as I've emphasized, that like if something goes wrong, the kind of normative Roman theory would say you just do the whole thing again, which could be a very expensive business. And so your other option was to just call out in a charming third person imperative, everything was done correctly. And then you just like go home. Or you proceed to barbecue or whatever it was they did. The blanket gods and goddesses is one version of a language of listing in Roman cult, a linguistic response to an epistemic conundrum which issues in phrasing of radical indeterminacy. It has a correlate in the singular, in ritual language that is addressed to or about a god for whom one has no name. So this is not a normative text describing future worship, but this is a quotation from the Clara E of the Arval Brethren, which is to say a set of records that the Arval Brethren, a priesthood in the suburbs of Rome, began making, in which it just wrote down records of what it had in fact done, which included for any given rite a listing of the gods to whom it addressed prayer or sacrifice. Likewise, near the temple, the magister sacrificed to Dea Dia, and the order of the gods observes a certain logic, Dea Dia being the god, the goddess to whom the temple was dedicated. So she always comes first. Likewise, to Dea Dia, 2 female cows. Oh, there's a typo. To Janus Pater, 2 male sheep. To Jupiter, 2 long-haired castrated sheep. I think I've got these right. Actually, the funny thing is I look at all these things and I was like, berbices, that's sheep. And then they use, arietes and blah, blah, blah. There's many different words for sheep. And if you look these up in a French dictionary, which is what I ultimately did, of course, they have very fine-grained terms for the different kinds of sheep, which I don't know. I grew up in Philadelphia. I don't have a clue what makes, like, I think it told me that a werebex was a wether. I don't have no clue what a wether. I mean, I looked it up, so I think it's a castrated sheep. But anyhow, I didn't want to write down wether as if it was some sort of weirdo mystery. To Mars, 2 long-haired male sheep. To Juno of Dea Dia, 2 sheep. To god or goddess, 2 sheep. To the divine maidens, 2 sheep. To the divine servant, 2 castrated sheep. To the lares, 2 castrated sheep. To the mother of gods, 2 sheep. To the god or goddess in whose protection are this grove in place, which is different than the goddess to whom the temple is dedicated. Here, the fact of sacrifice indicates that the existence of the god, that is the 2 unnamed gods, the fact of the sacrifice indicates that the existence of the god was not in question. It is in that sense a known god. There's a cutesy literature mostly deriving from about in the commentary tradition on Paul, where such figures are referred to as unknown gods, but there's nothing unknown about this god. John Scheid has said briefly that the language responds to the problem that the god has not taken the trouble to make itself known, so no one knew its name and no one knew whether it was male or female. That's a perfectly adequate formulation, but I might put it differently. The sacrifice is addressed to someone, and the fact that the sacrifice continues to be performed suggests that the practice was felt to be efficacious, otherwise they just stop, or they would change it. In which case you might say a convention had been reached about how to address the god. Its name was god or goddess. Certainly that was how the phrase was used, and for exactly the same reason as Jupiter was used for Jupiter. Romans had no idea that's how Jupiter was addressed. And certainly there's no reason to believe that's how Juno addressed him. It's how the humans addressed him. So a king, we're like zeroing in on democracy now, because a king simply adds. What happens in a republic? We might begin with the norm, or Cicero's version of it at least. This is from the kind of legislation that Cicero wrote for an ideal republic, basically the Roman Republic, in his work on the laws. Let no one have gods separately, neither new nor foreign, unless they have been recognized by the people acting as sovereign. Let them worship in private those whose worship has been duly handed down by their ancestors. The stakes of the adverb separatim are clarified by the polarity in the 2 sentences, publicae privatim. The first sentence concerns cult that takes place outside the family or gens, where normatively there is or should be only that which is public. The Roman terms populus and its derivatives are, of course, legal language. They refer to the citizen body and its sovereignty over the state. The term priva reflects a withdrawal of state interest. Hence, the private is that from which the state has withdrawn its claim. On Cicero's reckoning, which is non-controversial, I think, in respect of the other Roman evidence. The private is perforce familial, since what one does there is that which one has received from one's ancestors. To Cicero's theory, we can juxtapose evidence from practice, right? Might say evidence about practice, inflected as such evidence must be by the normative interests of the person who narrates it. The Severan apologist Tertullian denounces traditionalist Romans for having, quote unquote, decreed that a general should not dedicate a temple that he had vowed in war before the Senate approved, as in fact happened in the case of Marcus Aemilius, who had vowed a temple to the god Albernus. It's been argued that Tertullian derives this information from Cicero's contemporary Varro, which seems likely enough. My point is simply that in contrast to the free hand exercised by kings, Varro concurs with Cicero in supposing that only the people could bind itself to worship. That the mechanism by which this occurs at the Senate only makes the practice at Urso look more, quote unquote, republican, or at least in line with that of the republics of the provinces. And of course, Tertullian instantly gets, as it were, what intuitively surprises us about democracy and religion, because our assumptions about polytheism and piety are very much his. If the god in question was truly a god and had aided a Roman general and Roman army, what sort of world was it in which the humans simply chose whether to worship it? As to paraphrase Tertullian, perhaps it was not a god that consented to be treated so shabbily. So what do the calendars say, and how we might make their data speak to this question, not of addition, but subtraction? It's a problem, of course, that we do not have an official calendar from the city of Rome, which is to say, we do not have a list produced by Roman magistrates that itemizes the Sacra Publica for a full year under the Republic, let alone multiple such lists. Nevertheless, as Rupke's map makes clear, we do have many inscribed calendars, however partial or fragmentary. And from the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius, we have a great deal of epigraphic data and some literary evidence on festivals celebrated in the city of Rome. And this sequence, this kind of scattered bits of information, as always with epigraphic data, it's very difficult to aggregate and certainly time consuming. All this culminates in a month-by-month listing of the festivals in the so-called Codex Calendar of 354, the calendar of Philokalus, which is actually turns out to be a very hard document to get to, because when Mommsen produced an edition of the calendar of Philokalus for the Monumenta Germaniae Historica, he said that the calendrical information was too boring and he simply omitted it. So the only place you can get it anything like a respectable modern edition is de Grassi's edition in volume 13.2 of the Inscriptiones Italiae. The number of days devoted to the games exists in satire, of Christian apologetics, and in modern history as a sort of index of Roman decadence. And it's common to observe that in the late Republic, one might spend 57 days at the games. And by the mid-first century, 77 days could be spent at the games, and 135 in the reign of Marcus Aurelius, and about 175 days are devoted to games. This is the ludi, not all religious festivals, in the calendar of 354. It gets people in the early modern world terribly excited. Like, how could Rome have been a serious state that devoted so many days to holidays? It's completely ridiculous. I don't doubt that the increase has meaning, but it's not often enough observed that the holidays that are recorded in the calendar of 354 do not reflect simple aggregation from the age of Varro to the age of Constantius II. This is not to say that there are not some very old festivals in the list, but I pursued this only because I was put onto it by David Potter once upon a time. The additions that one can clearly date to the age of monarchy derive mainly from the reign of Aurelian and the reign of Constantine and his children. Despite the extraordinary number of total religious holidays in that list, not simply the ludi, but other days, which is 231, which is kind of embarrassing. Some holidays have in fact fallen off the list. And given the nature of Roman ritual, the disappearance of a holiday strongly suggests that some gods had ceased to receive public cult. The claim is not conclusive. We are, as I warned at the start, writing a history in which the principal evidence is absence. Now, we do have some evidence for what a calendar produced by the Duovari of the Colonia Genitiva Julia would have looked like. For example, the documents that are often denominated lege sacrae are actually tripartite in nature. They included a dedicatory text, a feriala, or a calendar of the rites to be performed at the altar, and regulations for the cult site regarding things like repair to the facilities, the rules governing gifts to the temple, and almost always ritual specifications about what to do when one wants to desacralize sacred properties and prepare them for sale. Where the most common such object, I mean, first of all, you accumulated a great deal of precious metal in these temples that they had to get rid of. And secondarily, I suspect that the other thing that they most often got rid of were, of course, some hides. That I assume that most of the leather and the BMWs of the ancient world came from temple sites. And you stood over them and yelled something like profanum esto, and then you sold them off. The altar at Narbo, whose right face, the altar at Narbo, whose right face I have already cited, includes on its front face a feriala, specifying the days on which rites will be held at the altar. I cite one example only from the list to give you a kind of idea of its flavor. This is the very start, so it includes this kind of announcement. The plebs of the Narbonenses have set up an altar in the forum at Narbo at each year on the 9th day before the calends of October, on which day the happiness of the age produced him as a ruler of the world. 3 Roman knights from among the people and 3 freedmen will sacrifice victims individually. And blah, blah, blah. Now, 2 patterns emerge from this list. The rites listed on the feriala that is inscribed on the altar take place at the altar. Not a stunning conclusion, but it'll have relevance in a moment. And the rites are dedicated or directed to the worship of the divinity to whom the altar was dedicated, namely the new men of Augustus. As I say, this latter pattern is not a necessary feature of the use of altars. You could, as with Dea Dia, you could sacrifice to other gods in a secondary and subordinate place after you've paid respect to the primary god. This slide displays 2 extracts from an inscription discovered in a shattered condition at the bottom of a well in Carthage. It was first published in 1999 by Lilian Enabli and republished alongside some additional fragments in 2007 by Enabli together with John Scheid. There are many, many fragments, and it gives the impression, I mean, it's pretty clear that the text was deliberately shattered and thrown into the well in antiquity. It was a thoroughly fascinating text. To take only the first fragment, the term megaro, or megarum, is attested at Ostia and Rome in the forms magarum, but also mager. It refers to the inner room of a temple of Isis. Sarmenta, from sarmentum, like twigs, is unattested epigraphically. Triklos, which is also found in many other spellings, which means something like bowers or summer houses, maybe like a little grape arbor, who knows, is used of dining spaces under 4-poled tents or something like that. Plutarch tells us that the feasts associated with the worship of Bona Dea involved dining in tents that were decorated with vines. Maybe this has something to do with that. Tricli, as an epigraphic matter, are attested at Rome and in Roman colonies, and in one municipium of Roman citizens, maybe Olisipo. And the word has been restored in the great inscription of the Fundus Aufidianus, and so on. I go through many more words like this. This is either a very Roman text, or you might call it a remarkable display of learned religious antiquarianism about the city of Rome, or you might just say it's a very colonial document. But what genre is it? The question on the tip of all your tongues. Now, Enabli supposed this was a lex sacra, and Scheid has concurred. The diagnosis is not assisted by the very amusing fragment among the many, there's about 20 fragments of this thing. Among the many fragments of this document, only one finite verb is preserved. So you can't really tell whether it's enjoining something for the future or recording things in the past. In addition, again, depending on, I mean, names of gods are actually a pretty puzzling thing. There might be 5 gods named, but it might be 6, and depending on your read, there might be 7 gods named. Not altogether clear, but there are 4 locations: the shore, two temples, but they're always cited as a pair, the Temples, the Capitolium, and maybe a temple of Isis. Furthermore, the gods seem to be, these fragments are pretty small, the gods seem to be cited individually. Whereas, in contrast, right, in the inscription of the Arval Brethren, the gods who are worshipped in subordinate position to Dea Dia are just itemized at each instance of practice. And of course, there's the major problem, as I say, of multiple locations. I think what we have here is not a lex sacra of a particular cult, but rather an extravagant recording on stone of the ritual calendar produced by the colony of Carthage in a given but unknown year. Just as at Urso, the calendar seems to have been established anew each year by a given year's magistrates. The Feriala would have parallels in several second century instances, and one later one, in which city councils inscribed on stone, rather than publishing on a whitened board, the roll of their members, which information would surely have been out of date very soon. So I'll close by reflecting on Roman theory about the subtraction of gods from the city's cults. The body material is unfortunately small, but there's likely to be more that I've yet to find. I would be greatly aided if you knew of something. Like Varro. Yeah. Varro, we are told by Augustine, feared lest the gods should perish, not through an enemy attack, but from the indifference of the citizens, negligentia civium, from which disaster, as he supposes, he says that he is rescuing them. Through books of this kind, he says they will be stored away and preserved in the memory of all good men, by means of a more careful act of care than was performed by Metellus when he rescued the objects of Vesta from the fire, or was performed by Aeneas when he saved the Penates from the fall of Rome. As a specific example, Varro offers the case of Sumanus. The ancient Romans worshipped Sumanus, to whom they attributed nocturnal lightning, more than Jupiter, to whom daytime lightning pertained. But after an outstanding and lofty temple was built for Jupiter, a multitude turned to him because of the dignity of the building, with the result that scarcely anyone can be found who remembers having read the name of Sumanus, which can now no longer be heard. Alongside the general problem of indifference or neglect, Varro cites the effect on affect, you might say, of changes in the cityscape. One is reminded here of the remarkable essay by Pliny, that is Pliny the Elder, on changing Roman technologies for telling time, or rabbinic reflections on the implications for announcing sunset of changes in the built environment. Now, what Varro cites is not a normative act, like a change in the calendar, or even a normative act that follows upon increasing indifference. But there exists, in fact, a body of Roman thinking to close this circle, or square the circle, namely legal theory on desuetude. And having cited legal epigraphy as an analog to the evidence of religion, I return now whence we began. We come full circle. In the first chapter of Book 20 of the Noctes Atticae, Gellius stages a conversation between the sophist Favorinus and the jurist Sextus Caecilius. Now, in many stories in Gellius, the sophist comes out on top, as you probably expect. That is not true when sophists meet jurists. In the event, Favorinus criticizes the 12 tables on various grounds, which provides an opportunity for him to go further and criticize Roman legal culture more generally. But though sophists and jurists do not agree on the interpretation of the 12 tables or the meaning to be found in its ongoing normative power, their statements betray a similar concern for something like the belatedness of Antonine Rome and the forms of social and linguistic change that Rome had undergone. So Sextus Caecilius says, for long lapse of time, longa aetas, has rendered all words and customs obsolete, and it is in light of those words and customs that the sense of laws is to be understood. Or Favorinus, for the Roman people allowed that such laws, which carried such immoderate penalties, should die out from hunger and old age. In the first passage, the jurist yokes language and custom as conventional institutions that the passage of time may change so much that earlier instances of language and earlier instantiations of norms may become unintelligible. Favorinus, wishing to indict the Romans for neglect of their own laws, makes the Roman people the agent in allowing the laws to die, as Varro had worried the gods would die. What the claims offer us is a theory of desuetude, passing into disuse. Now, it's often claimed, I think more often by moderns than the ancients, but sometimes even by the Romans, that consuetudo and mos, customs and tradition, could be treated as sources of law, and presumably they meant they could be upheld in court. But in fact, nothing of the sort ever happens. I could be wrong, but I at least can think of no instance when a Roman citizen litigant successfully asked a Roman court to vindicate a claim based on custom. I think it just never happens, ever, in the long history of Roman law. The Romans do say it happens when Roman magistrates adjudicate among peoples without written law and must uphold their norms. That is to say, unwritten laws are the sorts of things non-Romans have. But the Romans were not the sort of people who lacked written law. So the simple fact of the matter is that for all the Romans say consuetudo is a source of norms, I think it's never, ever, ever done in all of our very, very long and substantial history for the operations of Roman law. That's not true of desuetude. Desuetude actually works in practice. We are in fact supplied by Roman jurists with several descriptions of changes to law that occurred as a result of changing social practice, issuing in a change of norms that courts were in fact prepared to uphold. Here's just one, is Gaius on the form of the Roman marriage, and the particular form in which a wife could come into her husband's control. I'll skip all the ridiculous Roman terminology. A wife could come into her husband's control by a process that the lawyers analogized to usufruct. Hence, it was provided by the 12 tables that any woman not wishing to come under her husband's manus in this way should stay away from him for 3 nights each year, and thus interrupt the usus of each year. But the whole of this institution has been in part abolished by statutes, and in part consigned to oblivion by simple disuse. Now, Gaius does not specify the statutes by which the institution was dismantled, but he does identify 2 processes by which this occurred. One was, you might say, overt and rational purposive. Individuals exercising agency employed the machinery of lawmaking bodies to effect changes in positive law. The other process was the very opposite of agential. A gradual ceasing to pay attention made the law cease to be. What is more, partem, the processes were not unrelated. Which returns us to the gods, whose worship does not cease. Instead, they themselves die, all from the indifference of citizens. And then we change the calendar. Thank you very much. Mario, I should perhaps emphasize, right, that in addition, that since we're supposed to be talking about democracy, let me just mention democracy one last time, right, that the Roman theory of lawmaking was very much one of something like democratic legal legitimacy, right? That the standard Roman definition of law is something like jus est quod populus nuper jusit. Law is that which the people has most recently ordered. And the nuper is important because the Romans were quite emphatic that in all areas of law, including religious law, whatever was most recent was binding, not hoary antiquity. In any event, so the negligence of citizens was a kind of decision by the citizens about what the law was to be. That would be one interpretation, putting 2 bits of Roman legal theory together. Sorry to start again.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Questions, I hope, are welcome.
Sure. Yeah.
And we're doing it in 2 different ways. No, still not on? On? Yes. Okay. So I will be handing this to whoever is would like to ask a question in the audience, and please use it so that our colleagues, our virtual colleagues, or colleagues in the virtual realm, I should say, because they are real colleagues, can also hear your question. And then Duncan will every once in a while summarize and present questions from the audience not in the room. So Dylan.
Thank you. So that was terrific. Thank you. At the end, as you were talking about desuetude and negligentia, I started thinking about the frequency with which temples and shrines and things burn down or collapse, and they'll either be restored or not, and there may be an inscription with it that says, such and such shrine vetustate de lapsam refecit. But that occurred to me that could fit in with this sense of choice, right? These are opportunities for somebody to elect to go on with it or just leave it.
Yeah, an excellent additional data source in which it exactly illustrates the problem, which is to say the restored temples are the ones we know, because that's right, they were restored. So, when Augustus says, I mean, this is the sort of thing Carlos or Emily will remember, Duncan, how many, I mean, Augustus is like, how many? 82. Yeah, like many temples. It's apparently 82. Augustus says he restored 82 temples. I know that's 82 temples that were pretty close to De Lapsa when Augustus got to them. And how long after that? Like everybody, like, Augustus said we got to do it. I don't know. And then how many years after that? How many years after that did people stop paying attention? I presume some point after 14 AD. I mean, it's pretty clear in it's one of the only funny things that Tiberius did. But Tiberius's remark when somebody said, whoever it was took your father's name in vain, right? And Tiberius said, and they said, we want you to punish him. And Tiberius said, what is he? He said, well, my dad's a god, so he should take care of it. Which was, in fact, the rule in Roman trials on sacrilege, that if you swore an oath in the name of Jupiter and did something wrong, there was no human punishment. The Roman rule was exactly that the god would punish you. So it's both funny when Tiberius says it, but it also happens to be fully in accord with Roman. Anyhow, so that how long after Augustus did that, people continued to maintain the cult practice at those temples, let alone maintain the buildings. I don't know. But we don't know about the ones that weren't, when somebody simply reappropriated the land and used it for something else.
Can I ask a question on my own behalf, though? If someone on the Zoom call has a question, they should put it in the Q&A. I was thinking there was one case which I think you missed, which is perfect for you, which is the case of Pan in the lifetime of Tiberius, where we have this very strange story. I read here that it's in Plutarch of a sailor in the Aegean hears a voice. And right, so there's a Greek sailor, so maybe there's a little bit of, but this is a god who speaks to a Roman, and it says, when you get to your destination, the great god of Pan is there, and Tiberius calls together, and I remember this, I tried to write about it in my dissertation. It's a committee of philology, so he gathers the philologists to investigate whether Pan is really dead, and I think they just concur. They say, yep.
No, yeah,
so
right.
So Pan is a complicated case because it's not a god of the Roman state,
right.
But this is clearly a story circulating about a Roman emperor dealing with the perishing. Right. Same verb, I think. Yeah.
They so Ivan, that's an excellent. Thank you for that. I'm not actually terribly good at doing comprehensive searches for anything, but I will say that I do want to be perfectly clear. There are obviously many dedications at temples by individuals saying, ex somno, I saw the god in a dream. And they'll also say that God told me things. So, right, gods do speak to people. There's just this one single instance of a god speaking to a human in the context of state religion. Nor is any aspect of state religion ever said to be influenced by either an etiological myth or a speaking of the god. Right? It's also a pattern the Romans themselves avert, which so all of virtually every time the Romans tell the anecdote of Ius Locutius, they say it's totally totally freaking weird. It really freaked us out. You know, there was this voice, and you know, that was not what we expect. That's not the general pattern in, let us say, all of our history. Yeah, I mean, there is this other, I mean, there's another, I mean, Roman state institutions are occasionally called upon to adjudicate these matters. And amusingly enough, they're called, I mean, in the cases we have, it is virtually always exactly the same reason why American state institutions are called upon, because there's a dispute about tax status. I mean, basically, then as now, you know, religious properties were tax exempt, right? So there's the best attested case is this funny one from the age of Cicero, where Cicero himself mentions in De Natura Deorum, and we have an epigraphic record of the decision of the Senate in the matter, and it's the cult site outside Athens, and it right, and it's Amphiaraus, and it's right, and he's a hero. And actually, there are further implications. Not much discussed about this, but basically the question is, the relevant piece of the IRS code says that temple properties are tax exempt that are dedicated to an immortal god, and the what's this called? The publicans claim that you're a hero by virtue of once having been born is not an immortal god. And the whole the ending, we don't really have the ending in the decision, but since the thing rather amusingly begins, you know, this is the result of the Senate deliberation between the god Amphiaraus and the publicans. They sort of tip their hand about where the whole thing is going to go. But this is not by no means alone when the Romans being called upon to adjudicate. So Roman state authorities do have on some regular basis to address questions about what we might think of as theological or religious questions that do not concern gods of the state religion. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, one could deduce more.
This is asked out of pure ignorance. So it's just a quirk of the Roman state that they allow, sort of, they elect the gods and then they allow them to die? Is this a peculiar to how the Roman Republican religion is organized, and there aren't any other civilizations proximate that are doing this kind of thing? And so they're just a very bizarre, or is this just kind of common and we just haven't really noticed this? This way in which the gods sort of, you know, come and go and fall into desuetude. I mean, it's a beautiful picture to me,
Right.
Of this kind of collapsing temples and forgotten gods and, you know, abandoned shrines.
There are people in the room who could say a great deal more about the.
You know, no doubt, know more about this than me, though.
Yeah. So one answer is yes. It's pretty clear that there are temples and cults that fall into a substantial state of disrepair in Greece, and I could talk a little bit about the fact of their falling into disrepair. What I don't know, I simply haven't looked into it, is whether they have an accompanying body of theory about this, which has, as I say, in the Roman case, this very close analogical relationship, in part because of the prestige status of Roman law, in which I think there is this alternate body of theory that expressed in a very similar language that I think bears on what they would have said. So there's a lattice there in Rome that I can offer you that I can't offer in other cases, but there are certainly other cases. I mean, one of the problems is that our fascination. I mean, I begin, and I'm actually serious that, you know, we, meaning people in a kind of Western Christian or Western post-Christian tradition, have been much more fascinated with polysystems that are additive, and we're much more fascinated with the kind of these forms of worship that just hang on. You know, so I know there are stories that are told in colonial sources in Latin America, not simply about European destruction of quote unquote gods, but also, you know, acts of destruction performed in a colonial context prior to the Europeans, in as it were, in the recorded memory of peoples. And there's much discussion there, but often these stories are told because somebody will turn out to have restored the temple, or, you know, when somebody discusses that somebody, you know, there was some struggle and somebody accidentally broke, or somebody deliberately destroyed some huaca, you know, some oracular rock, it'll turn out that people avoided even the area of the stream where the fragments of the rock were, people avoid it. And there's a story like this in antiquity in a life of a guy named Porphyry, who was bishop in Gaza. It's just a completely, it is, I think, the funniest document from antiquity. It tells this hilarious story, hilarious story of Porphyry bribing the empress. He goes to Constantinople. He says, please let me destroy the temple. And the emperor is actually fascinating on these grounds too. The emperor says something like, why do you want to go cause unrest? If you destroy this temple, the people will get uprising. They'll leave the city. They won't pay taxes. It'd be bad for you. It'd be bad for me. We've deprived their temple of revenue, and the thing will just die out. I mean, I could deduce late evidence like this, in which people say, you don't actually have to attack the pagans or even enjoin conversion. It'll just die out. And Porphyry gets very upset, and he wants to act. So he pays a nurse. He bribes a nurse who they approach the empress and say, when the emperor refuses, they give the empress their petition. And since I have a 17-month-old elsewhere in Berkeley, I will simply say that somebody holding the baby, Ezekiel wouldn't put up with this. The person holding the baby nods its head. And he says, it's a miracle. And then the emperor is like, oh, it's such a fucking pain. He said, go destroy the temple. He clearly doesn't believe it. But, the whole thing has happened in public. He says, yeah, fine, go destroy the temple. So they go and destroy the temple, and they smash this statue of Aphrodite. And just to prove, like a piece of spolia, that they really triumphed over Aphrodite, they make a mosaic in front of the church out of the fragments of Aphrodite. And the whole passage closes with the announcement, and everyone entered the church through the side door, just in case. In that case, the god didn't die.
I think Dylan.
So this is just a possible example occurred to me of a non-surviving cult that has survived, but other people, my memory of this is so weak that other people may be able to correct this. This is Bibulus, right? Like this guy with the temple that's now, like, I think the tabularium has been built around.
Right.
And you don't so much hear about him after
Right.
that. Does Bibulus have a life after this happens?
We find him in late antique sources still, so they knew about. I mean, can I actually ask? I think maybe as a sort of supplement or follow up. I mean, so I don't doubt that gods fell out of worship. That must have happened. I'm sure we can record it, and it must have happened for just pragmatic reasons. The altar wasn't well built. Someone demolished it, expanded the house a little bit, that kind of thing. And I don't doubt that occasionally even a priest just decided that this particular ritual wasn't going to happen. What I wonder is how much that there was actually a theory of it. So I suppose I'm posing an objection. I wonder whether
Duncan, I'm crushed. You don't buy it.
I have some skin in this game, so I wonder whether I wonder whether Varro and on a different level the jurists are kind of up to a different kind of game, which is that they are asserting authority by being the ones who do the saving, by being the ones who know the sort of in Manu marriage originally had this kind of rule, but it doesn't obtain anymore. And it's less that they have there's a great deal of social concern with any of this, or even a theory, but rather a kind of set of claims to intellectual authority based on the fact that you are the antiquarian, if I dare use that term, who knows about Simanus, or you are the jurist who can tell you about the rule relating to how many nights away. But there's not really a theory as such, but a kind of authority claim rhetoric.
Sure. I'm not sure it amounts to an either or case. I mean, I would say like one, so in the case of the jurist, I think I think it's clear that, right, they're not saving anything in the sense that when they, I mean, they are making a claim to knowledge. They're saying we happen to know what used to be done, but they're not saying that we're ever going to get back there. No one has any interest in doing it. And there's a lot of Roman writing on social change being the kind of leader to legal change. It continues straight through one of the dedicatory texts of the digest includes a kind of explanation of by the Emperor Justinian. He says, oh, I think because things keep happening noviter in a kind of new way, we just, we keep having to make more law. And one of the things where, he's like, Justinian wrote a lot of laws. He's like, literally, I got the carpal tunnel, it's just killing me. But he says, unfortunately, things keep happening noviter, so I keep having to write new law or revise old law. In that case, and the other puzzle is, right, that Gaius among jurists does have an unusual interest in legal history. It's thanks to the start of Gaius Book 4 that we know anything about the forms of ritual of the leges actiones. The other jurists, what's the point? I mean, we left that behind. So I think throughout the digest, there are a couple of more scattered references to the change in positive law. I think, I don't think that quite captures it. I mean, Varro obviously just announces that he's doing a favor for, I don't know, someone.
But he's, I mean, the full passage
Right.
here, right? He says he's scriberes.
Right.
So he
Right.
says he writes up,
Right.
but he doesn't say what then they're going to be worshipped
Right.
again
Right.
properly. Sumanus is not coming back.
Right.
It's just that he knows about it and
Right.
he writes it up.
Sure, I'm not, but it can also, right, he can be, the data is the data that he provides, which is simultaneously data for a social change, but also data for his own, the data of his, the evidences of his own knowledge. That's accompanied by something like a theory about how it happens, and something like a claim about why it matters. I mean, I guess I think that the Roman religious landscape, I mean, that virtually, the Romans have many indices along which many indices of social change they gather. They're interested in changes in language, and they're interested in changes in custom and changes in diet and so on. There's a certain number of them. And I do think that there's a small amount of interest in change in something like the set of practices that constituted Roman religion. And mostly what they talk about is mostly what interests us, which is the gradual addition of God, including an interest in non-state religion. So there's all this interest in like immigrants to Rome and who they're worshiping. And sometimes in a kind of material way, they impinge upon public cult because of these somewhat crazy stories. I mean, who knows how it happens, that they tell that occasionally some private person sets up an altar in a public space. And frankly, no one cares because the Romans, I mean, they were actually kind of indifferent to issues of religion. I don't know, John Shire would like it. I say, until somebody gets excited and like goes around and like tells them, let's say, the anecdotes always say somebody like, what's his name in Casablanca. I'm shocked to discover your Jewish altar in this public space, and they tell them to remove it. And none of which is entirely plausible. It's a form of anecdote that they repeatedly tell. So I guess, that I think it must be, as with the declining of temples, that, gods fall out of worship. And the question then becomes both how to tell that as a story, whether it can be told as a story that has to do with democracy. And I think, I think it kind of maybe does, and whether the Romans noticed. I think they kind of did.
So thank you for that fascinating talk, which I'm still grappling with in many ways. And I'll come back to precisely the point with which you just ended, by way of a sort of digression to South Asia, where, the question of ducetitude works appears in at least two dimensions. One, of course, as you know, the complete vanishing of an entire species of gods in South Asia that I think is more or less unremarked and seems to happen, by the beginning of the first, 500 years of the first millennium. And the other is, of course, if you were to accept Aziz Al-Azmi's proposition that Romanity continues in a sense through Islam itself. Here you have a kind of explicit theory of destitute in the sense that on the one hand, under places that come under Islamic rule, the idea certainly very clearly in South Asia is that new temples and new churches cannot be built, right? And old ones cannot be repaired. But worship can be permitted in them. Whereas mosques that have fallen into disrepair, the most meritorious thing you can do is sort of repair them. And so this raises, this for me, I see this as a sort of clear public engagement with the question of the falling into disrepair or the dying of gods and its political significance. But the question is there something, particularly democratic about the way that this process is mediated in the Roman and the late Roman Empire? That in a sense, the question of democracy interpolates itself into a larger question that would be familiar in other places and times, that democratic power in a certain way exercises itself in even this domain, which would be familiar in other places.
So it's easier to talk about the point which you weren't putting as a question, which is the comment. So when your local bishop wasn't as enthusiastic as Porphyry, there were all sorts of other ways. And the primary way, and there's a body of theory about it, probably the clearest statement of such a theory about encouraging conversion by never allowing things to lapse is in Gregory of Tours' instruction to the other Saint Augustine, that is Augustine of Canterbury. I think the evidence is preserved both in the corpus of Gregory and also I think it's quoted in Bede, in the history of the Venerable Bede, which he says, dear Augustine, good luck in Britain, and when you get there, do this, basically also offer an alternative thing to do each weekend with better food. And there's a kind of little thing about, like dusting out their temples with smoky incense or doing various things like this. But basically it's a theory of it's a very material theory about how and why conversion takes place. And conversion is of course also a story about people letting go. And you can do forced conversion. There are lots of people who tried that, but there are also lots of theories of conversion which amount to conversion as letting go. And so there's a lot of late ancient evidence of that kind, not unconnected to the practices and theories of early Islam, of course, in its context. Maybe not England. Democratic. The late ancient evidence, I don't think, Susanna might have something more to say. My knowledge there is, it's not comprehensive. I can't think, and I didn't venture there. Also, as scattered as this was, it existed in my head as a tightly woven story. So I didn't wander into the late empire. The late imperial evidence I can think of best is internal to the operations of Christian communities, both election of bishops, but also the operation of councils and the importance of kind of communal decision-making, or for that matter, the insertion of non-communal forms of decision-making in those instances. So I'm sorry, I haven't got a great answer there.
I have a question from Zoom. I will say the Altar of Victory famous event where the Senate beg for their statue and altar of the goddess Victory back might be a sort of democratic attempt in the face of Christian kind of refusal or forced destitute. The question is from Kevin Oguni. I was interested that he pointed out that contemporary satires more often mentioned the details and extent of Roman holiday celebration. The question is there anything to be said for the role of satire, I suppose, a mockery, in preserving, shaping these kind of these cults in general, but also I think centrally the destitute, right? I think Kevin is asking about the role of mockery in sort of generating generating desuetude or discourse of desuetude, I suppose. I added that to Kevin.
Right. Huh. I can't, so the question's a very fine one, both in theory and of course in practice, because there's a lot of Roman evidence. It's not just, of course, Christian evidence about Roman practices they thought were idiotic. The Romans spent a lot of time mocking the idiocy of their own practice, including, you know, also old ones. So I admit the kind of interest and cogency of the question, but I can't, off the top of my head, draw a causal connection anywhere. It's clear that something's right. Something is going on, that things become susceptible to mockery. And in that sense, as with the kind of, I'll say Gaius's theory, since you don't like my claim about Varro, as with Gaius's theory, right? Social change is probably is almost undoubtedly the leading factor, right? It's not somebody who becomes extremely bold and takes the very popular cult of Isis and just strikes it in the calendar for the following year. It's, you know, so the mockery is secondary in time to something else, I suspect. But a causal connection to, as it were, a forgetting or letting go, I can't think of a case. But I'll look into that. That'd be hard.
Thank you, Kevin. I think there's one more question and then we should let you off the hook.
All right, I'll be short. Thank you. It was fascinating. I wanted to go back to the question of how do you tell the story of this change of losing gods along the way, and the analogy that you suggested about laws that change and religious practices that change, which is, I think, very fascinating. So there are two ways, like you said, of changing the law, right? Either you make a new law or you forget the old one. But then those two ways are very different, right? Because when you make a new law, you're very intentional about it. Everything is on purpose. When you forget the law, so in the process, in between, if you'd approach somebody that's not practicing the law and you would ask, what are you doing? Are you not? It says, oh, that's okay. You don't have to practice that. No, that would not be the answer. Like if somebody invoked the law, then somebody would have to say, yes, there is this law. The only way this law can go out of use in this way is if people actually forget it. It's not a deliberate way of forgetting. It's a negligence of the law that allows for this. And like you just said, eventually it's a matter of social change, right? So the difference between maybe the Roman, all religions goes through social change and they forget their ancient practices. But maybe the difference is in the post factum attitude towards what happened. Like with the law, if we forgot it, we forgot it. We don't care about it anymore. So maybe with the Romans, that's what specializes their.
Yes, there's no moment when somebody returns to the Romans a picture. I mean, you could have a reaction to somebody delivers Varro's divine antiquities to Julius Caesar and he rends his garment and falls off his throne and weeps because he's been reminded of what the Roman religion actually should have been. You can think of examples like that in the ancient Mediterranean, but that's not what Julius Caesar presumably did when he got the divine antiquities. There is a wider body of kind of Roman reactions to old laws. One of the funny things that the Romans do is not explicitly abrogate earlier legislation. So in the Lex Repetendarum, I'm pretty sure. So the first of our surviving epigraphically preserved statutes, 123 or something, there is some moment when, you know, they say, you know, there's a vague concern, some clause in the Lex Repetendarum, which is a long and complicated bit of Latin, says something like, you know, it clearly has some implications for, and Carlos might remember, like something like a prior Lex Calpurnia, I don't know. And it sort of says, you know, nothing about what's happening in this thing should be taken in any way to interfere with the operation of the Lex Calpurnia. Now, there are times when laws say that kind of savings clause sits there, and it's because they're actually saying it's not not to interfere with the operations of the Lex Calpurnia. And there are other times where they're saying, what we're doing here rewrites the Lex Calpurnia, but we're not going to abrogate it. I mean, a very important case in point dealt with via different legal operation is concerns manumission, where there was a set of statutes in Rome, or so they claimed. We don't have any of the wording, but a set of statutes that they claim govern manumission to citizenship of slaves. And there are various reasons why improperly manumitted slaves shouldn't have been citizens or something. But without ever abrogating the law, there's a phrase that the praetor, in an effort to correct or amend or something, in the blah, 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 protects the slaves under, I don't know the exact wording, I should, God. But it's something like under a guise of freedom. It's clear that what he's doing. And then in Gaius and elsewhere, there's a kind of tracing out of what are we to make of these slaves who are by law still slaves, but who are merely exist in a kind of fiction of freedom, thanks to the work of the praetor. And you would have thought the simplest thing in the world would be, I mean, by the 2nd century, what did you have? 300, I don't know, just take a wild conservative number, 300, 500,000 freed slaves, all of whom had been living lives as citizens when they were in fact slaves. I mean, that's a stupid way to run your society. Why not just abrogate the earlier law? But they overwhelmingly, they have a set of these, both what you might call moves, a set of these moves, often utilizing a narrow range of linguistic operations to announce that, oh dear, I'm not supposed to do that. To announce that they're no longer enforcing the earlier law without ever explicitly removing it from the books. That's part of this larger story about the ongoing existence of the past and the present and how they dealt with that.
All right, I thank you so much, Cliff. We owe you a further round of applause. Thank you. Thank you, online viewers.